Hello and welcome to episode 59 of the Climate Skeptic podcast. I'm your guest host, Ellie Hodges. Now, the 97% consensus on climate change has been repeated endlessly, but how robust is the research behind claims like this? And what happens when you look closely at the quality of the science? Well, joining me to discuss all of that and more is Dr. Jose Durarte, social psychologist and author of the Valid Science Substack. Welcome, Jose.
Oh, I'm happy to be here, Ellie. It's kind of an important topic.
So why do you think that so much of the research into the climate consensus is flawed after your headline claim in your article?
Well, hysteria over climate change is a major leftist plank. Academia is dominated by leftists, and academic research that bolsters leftist narratives tends to be methodologically flawed across the board, across domains and fields. So this, at the first level, this is just an example of that broader phenomenon. It's the same phenomenon we saw if you try to read Jason Arde's work, or if you look at the psychology research focused on the psychology of conservatives, you'll find a lot of false claims and methodological flaws there as well. What's specifically weird and unusual about the climate consensus research is that we see a tremendous amount of methodological flexibility, right? So the methods they're using are invented insane methods that are unknown to science and thus have no name. It's hard to even talk about them because you sound crazy just explaining what they did. And it might actually come down to one man in the case of the two viral findings that we talk about most, which is the 97% and the 99% figures. They were both published in the same journal, in Environmental Research Letters, edited by the same editor at both times, Daniel Kamen, who used to be at Berkeley. He's a maniacal partisan who unbelievably resigned from a science post in 2017. And in his letter to President Trump at the time, he spelled out the word impeach with the first letter of each paragraph of the letter. So he secretly basically encoded the word impeach in a letter resigning from a science post in 2017 when Trump had been in office for all of a few months. And that's a very vivid illustration of the kind of political actor, political person who is responsible for publishing a lot of the junk we see. And he's literally the man who published both the 97% and the 99% scams.
And you highlight some extraordinary examples of papers being included in consensus studies, including one about fingerprint solvents. How can something like that end up being counted? And what does it tell us about these studies?
Well, it was counted because the authors didn't know what they were doing, and the method was completely invalid. So what they did is they did a keyword search on the academic literature, all of it, right? And they searched for climate change, global climate change, and global warming. That's it. So they searched these terms. And while they said they excluded social science and other stuff, they didn't reliably exclude most of it. And they took a random sample of 3,000 papers. And of course, that fingerprint solvent paper, it mentions climate change, right? It mentions climate change mitigation because the incumbent chemical, the chemical they've been using for this fingerprint solvent work, this forensic work, is classed as having a global warming potential of whatever. It's completely irrelevant, of course, because all the fingerprint solvent in the world is not going to have any effect on the Earth's climate or on a planetary climate system of any planet. Because they mentioned climate change, that got them included in this amateur keyword search, right? The authors didn't know how to do a proper literature search or any kind of systematic review. They just searched on these popular keywords, which are not even going to get you the relevant climate science. So that got them included. And then the raters in this method, the raters were tasked with just reading the abstracts of all these irrelevant journal articles, like articles about fingerprint solvent. And those raters rated the article as an example of mitigation, and they rated it as, they gave it a 3 in their scoring system. A 3 is implicit endorsement of, human-caused warming. And because that was it, I mean, that they included that in their 99%. This was in the 99% paper by Linus et al. So, of course, this paper is completely irrelevant to climate science. It's about fingerprint solvents, right? It's a very narrow industrial topic, has no bearing on the scientific question at all. And you can't count papers, you can't count abstracts or do any kind of arithmetic to measure a consensus anyway. So that's basically how it got included.
And the famous 97% consensus figure has been repeated for years, but you point out that everything depends on how researchers frame the question. How much does the figure change depending on whether you're asking if humans have influenced the climate, are the main cause of recent warming, or whether climate change will be harmful?
Well, we actually don't have any published consensus that I know of on that latter question, which is on whether climate change will be harmful. Notably, when the 97% finding was published, that's the Cook et al. 2012, President Obama famously tweeted it, and he said that 97% of scientists agree that it's real and happening or something. And he added, and dangerous. He appended, and dangerous, so which the 97% study did not address at all. Did not attempt to address or purport to address any ratings of or assessments of harm or danger. So that was simply a false claim by Obama. And that tweet was, got everyone very excited. The editor I mentioned earlier, who campaigned for Obama, touted Obama's tweet. He loved that his journal was being, promoted by the president. What we do find as far as the split in percentage is if you ask if human activity has merely contributed to the observed warming of, say, the last century or so, then you get something like 97% invalid research. But if you ask if human activity is the main cause, the primary cause, primarily responsible for something along those lines of the observed warming, then the consensus drops to 78 to 82% figure, which I posted about a decade ago. So valid research, which is surveys of actual climate scientists, none of this fingerprint solvent nonsense, no one reading abstracts, but actually surveying working climate scientists. You get a somewhat smaller consensus if you ask if humans are the primary driver. That might not be true 10 years later, but that's where we saw the split. We don't have much research that I know of on the issue of danger or harm.
And you argue that the unit of consensus should be people rather than papers. If you wanted to establish what climate scientists actually believe, how would you design the study?
I would make it a survey of people, right? So I would find every working climate scientist I could by going to every university listing, every university website of climate science, atmospheric science, earth sciences departments. They're in a variety of places, right? Academia is kind of complex that way. And I would send out surveys to these people and ask them the questions we just discussed, which is has human activity emissions contributed to the observed warming? And then have human activities been responsible for most of the observed warming, the primary driver, right? And I would ask questions about the future, which is more important than the past, and like what they think about what are the realistic scenarios and projections, and to your question about harms, which is, as I said, missing from the published research. It's all about just whether it's happening or whatever. But if we want to know about harms, to the extent we care about this topic, which I think is optional, I would ask them about what harms do you envision, and what about these so-called extreme weather events and frequencies of things like hurricanes and storms and droughts, and do you think any of that is going to be significantly impacted, and so on. So I'd be asking these people these direct questions with well-written survey